Thank you to Koei Tecmo and Team Ninja for providing me with a review copy of Fatal Frame 2 ahead of its release. For anyone who hasn't played the original, Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly follows twin sisters Miyu and Mayu who become trapped in an abandoned village. As they try to find a way out, they slowly uncover the dark history behind the village and the rituals that once took place there. Like the original game, the story leans heavily into psychological horror and atmosphere rather than fast-paced action, with the series' iconic camera obscura returning to capture hostile spirits and uncover clues about what took place before our arrival. Just for a bit of context about my own history with this series, the first Fatal Frame game was actually one of the very first survival horror games I ever played back in the early 2000s, when I was definitely too young to be playing it. Because of that, it's always held a bit of a special place in my heart. That being said, it's never really been a series that I've regularly come back to over the years. I've played Crimson Butterfly well over 15 years ago at this point, and dipped my toe in and out of the newer series entries, so going into this remake I was both really excited and really curious to see what a modern interpretation of it would look like. I feel like I'm in a bit of a weird middle ground with the franchise. I have that nostalgia and prior experience with it, but I'm also someone who hasn't really kept up or stayed invested in the newer entries, so when I saw the announcement for Crimson Butterfly, I really felt that this could be a good entry point of reintroducing myself to the franchise. Over the last couple of days, I've been able to spend some time with the upcoming remake, and today I'm going to give you my spoiler-free thoughts before the game officially releases tomorrow. In this review, I'm going to talk about my general impressions after playing the game, some of the things the remake does really well, a couple of things that didn't quite click for me, and ultimately whether I think this game is worth picking up. Overall, this remake feels very faithful to the original 2003 game, but somehow also manages to feel like a completely different experience at the same time. From the very beginning, you can tell that the developers really wanted to preserve the pacing that made the original Crimson Butterfly so memorable for fans of the series. The atmosphere, the unsettling environments, and that sense of quiet tension are all very much still here. At the same time though, the visual overhaul and some of the modern adjustments give the game a noticeably different feel compared to its original PlayStation 2 version. It's still telling the same story and following the same structure to a degree, but the presentation just makes the game feel different in a way that I feel only people who have played both versions of the game will understand. This isn't a fast-moving horror game that constantly throws actions or jump scares at you. Instead, it takes its time, letting the environments and story do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to building tension. One of the biggest highlights for me is the visual upgrade. The character models look great, and the environments have been completely overhauled compared to the original. The village itself feels eerie and oppressive in a way that really fits the tone of the story, strangely in a way that still feels really different to the original, but still just right. Lighting, fog, and environmental details all work together to create a really unsettling atmosphere, and it does a great job of pulling you into the terror. What makes the visual improvements even more impressive is remembering when the original game actually came out. Crimson Butterfly originally released back in 2003 on the PlayStation 2, and personally, I think its graphics style is still one of the most unique and visually appealing of the era. Seeing a game that already had such a strong visual identity get a full modern makeover like this is really cool to see. Another big positive is that this remake brings the story of Crimson Butterfly to a completely new audience. Survival horror as a genre has seen a huge resurgence over the last few years, but if you actually wanted to play the original game today, it's not exactly easy. Physical PS2 copies can easily cost over £100 for a game that's now more than 2 decades old, so having this remake available on modern platforms makes the story far more accessible for players who may have heard about the game over the years but never had a realistic way to experience it for themselves. And I honestly do think this remake is probably the best way for most parents to experience the story of Fatal Frame 2. Even though I'm usually a bit of a purist when it comes to older games, this version runs really smoothly, and the visual upgrades make the whole experience feel much more modern and approachable. From a practical standpoint, it's kind of a no-brainer if you're coming into the game for the first time. That being said, I do think the original and the remake end up capturing slightly different vibes. Even though they're telling the same story, the limitations and presentation of the original PS2 version create a different atmosphere in places, and dare I say even scarier. However, the polish of the remake is undeniable, so if you do happen to own a copy of the original, or you've got the patience to track down one for a good price, it could actually make for a really interesting comparison between the two versions and how differently the same story can feel depending on how it's presented. Now, with that said, there were a couple of things that didn't fully land for me, and I want to stress that these are more about personal preference than outright flaws. Playing this remake actually made me realise and finally accept that I don't think the Fatal Frame style of gameplay is the best fit for me personally. I found that at times the pacing leaned more towards frustrating than tense. In particular, the camera obscura combat occasionally felt tedious for me rather than fun or innovative. That's not to say the system itself is poorly designed. At this point it's iconic, and I know that as the series has evolved, there are a lot of techniques, timing mechanics and strategies that players can learn to really maximise the use of the camera during encounters. Longtime fans of the franchise who understand those systems will probably get a lot more depth and satisfaction out of the combat than I did. After a few hours of playing, I did start to pick up on some of those techniques and began to understand how the game expects you to approach ghost encounters. Once you start recognising patterns, managing your distance and timing your shots properly, the combat definitely begins to make a bit more sense and feel a lot more rewarding, so it's clear that the system is something you can learn and improve at over time. However, I do think the skill ceiling feels quite high from the very beginning. For someone returning to the series after a long break, or for someone completely new, that early learning curve can feel pretty steep. Before those mechanics start to click, some encounters can feel a little repetitive or drawn out, which in turn can take away from the tension the game is trying to build. I can absolutely see how players who stick with it and really master the camera mechanics will get a lot more out of the combat system, but I do think it asks quite a lot from the player right from the get-go. One other thing I noticed relates to some of the story pacing, especially in a few key moments where scenes either felt stretched out longer than I remembered from the original, or in some cases cut surprisingly short. The most noticeable example of this for me was actually right at the start of the game. The opening of Crimson Butterfly in the original release, I think, is one of the more iconic introductions in survival horror. It does a really great job at setting the tone, establishing the mystery, and slowly building tension while introducing the player to the mechanics and world around them. It takes its time, letting the atmosphere develop naturally before delivering some genuinely memorable scares and combat encounters. That opening sequence really uses environmental storytelling to pull you into the world and make you feel like you're in Mio and Mayo's shoes. In the remake though, I felt that this section moved along far too quickly. Certain moments that I remembered from the original and that I was really curious to see reinterpreted with this remake either felt shortened or just weren't present at all. It's not something that completely breaks the experience, but it was one of the few areas where I actually felt the original handled things slightly better. But as someone returning to the series after a long time, and especially for a completely new player, I can see the learning curve being pretty steep. There were moments where I felt like I was fighting the mechanics a little more than the ghosts themselves, and that could make encounters feel drawn out rather than genuinely scary. There was one particular boss fight I was stuck on for no joke, almost 40 minutes, trying to figure out what it was that would finally let me progress to the next area. I often found myself having to reload older saves to really scavenge for film and spend my points on different items to try different combinations. Some players may love this. Unfortunately for me, it grew old pretty quickly. Another thing I noticed is that sometimes the game throws quite a lot at you all at once. You've got different film types, camera upgrades, charms, the shop system, side quests, and a whole bunch of other mechanics laid on top of the exploration and combat. I understand the intention is to give players depth and freedom in how they approach things, but occasionally I found myself unsure about what I should actually be prioritising or focusing on. Games like this definitely aren't meant to be rushed, but I do think some of those systems could have been introduced more gradually. At times it felt like everything was presented all at once and you're just expected to figure it out, which is fine for some players, but a bit more guidance early on might have helped smooth out some of the experience for me. And I get that again, this is probably a me issue more so than a game design issue, but it's something I noticed a lot throughout my playthrough. And finally, I did struggle a bit with the UI and the default control scheme. As a console player, the layout felt a bit unintuitive at first. For example, having X open the menu while A is used as the dodge button, it just felt weird. In the middle of combat, I often found myself going against years of muscle memory, which definitely added to the frustration during some encounters. However, I could also see this adding another layer of tension and fear for certain players. In the game's defense, these controls can be completely rebound and customized, so it's not a permanent issue, but during my time with the default setup, it did occasionally interrupt the flow of gameplay for me. One new feature that I did really enjoy though is the new photo mode. It's surprisingly detailed and lets you capture some really atmospheric shots of the environments and characters. Considering how great the game can look at times, it's actually a really nice addition and something players who enjoy virtual photography will probably spend quite a bit of time experimenting with. I often found myself pausing mid-fight or positioning characters against backdrops to create my own screenshots. That said, it does suffer from some of the rather odd controls which I mentioned earlier, which can make getting the exact angle you want a bit fiddly. I also have to admit, the inclusion of stickers did feel a bit strange, especially as so many of them feel out of place, though it did end up being oddly funny at times. Still, these small issues aside, as far as in-game photo modes go, it's a solid feature and a welcomed addition, which other horror games really should take note of. There's also a brand new ending included in this remake, which is something exclusive to this version of the game. I won't go into any details about it here to keep things spoiler free, but it's definitely an interesting addition. For longtime fans of the series, especially those who know the original Crimson Butterfly well, this is absolutely something you'll probably want to go out of your way to unlock. It adds an extra incentive to fully explore the game and see everything it has to offer, even if you've already experienced the story before. So overall, I think this remake will absolutely exceed expectations of fans of the series, especially those who love the original Crimson Butterfly. However, if you're new to the series or coming into this expecting an action-packed, jump-scare-filled game, this might not be the experience you're looking for. It's much more about atmosphere, slow burn tension, and narrative, so if that sounds like you, I'd definitely check it out and see for yourself. Likewise, if you're looking for something more casual or easier to dip in and out of, I probably wouldn't recommend it. This is a game that really asks for perseverance and patience from the player. At times, the pacing can feel extremely slow, and there are moments where pushing forward can feel like a real slog. But for the right players, especially those who value emotional stories over fast-paced gameplay, it really is an incredibly rewarding experience. If you're already a Fatal Frame fan, or you've been curious about the series for a while, this remake is probably the easiest and most accessible way to experience Crimson Butterfly. It stays very faithful to the original while modernising the right things enough to make it feel currently fresh and new. Personally, I'm really glad I got the chance to revisit the story again after so many years, and I'd be really interested to hear from people who played the original. Whether you're planning to pick up the remake, or if you think some games are better left exactly as they were, let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you plan on playing the remake. And again, a huge thank you to Koei Tecmo and Team Ninja for providing me a review copy of Fatal Frame 2 ahead of its release, and a huge thank you to all of you who have watched this video today.